Okay, I think we're reaching a kind of critical mass. So just welcome everybody and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rachel Kitchen. I am a corporate climate campaigner at Stand.earth, working on our fossil-free fashion campaign. And I'm really excited to be hosting this conversation this morning. Stand.earth is an international climate advocacy organization, and our fashion campaign is working to kick fossil fuels out of the fashion industry. But one thing that we know has become increasingly clear to us over the last few years is that decarbonization as an end goal is not enough. What we need to be talking about, and what I'm excited to bring in this conversation today, is really about that intersection of women's rights, human rights, climate justice, and a fair and equitable transition off of fossil fuels for the workers and communities in the fashion industry's supply chains. So to kind of mold this conversation today, I'm really happy to say that we have a wonderful facilitator with us who is Nirvana Mujtaba, and she's going to be the one kind of bringing our questions to the panelists from a women's rights policy and advocacy lens in order to help us kind of frame a discussion on power systems, challenges, and end with a goal of producing some practical steps for different supply chain actors in ensuring that rapid, fair, and equitable transition for the industry. Nirvana Mujtaba is the Women's Rights and Policy Advocacy Specialist at Oxfam Canada, which is a prestigious NGO known for its efforts in combating inequality and patriarchy while addressing poverty and injustice. She's a human rights advocate with nearly a decade of experience in policy advocacy and human rights due diligence. Nirvana brings a comprehensive understanding of policy influencing, advocacy, and business influencing to promote human rights, gender justice, labor rights, and social protection for historically marginalized populations. Her efforts help to amplify the voices of those who are often ignored, supporting their well-being and ensuring their rights are acknowledged and protected. And I think that really makes her the absolute perfect person to kind of frame this conversation for us, so that we're not talking about decarbonization in the abstract, but about how it relates to people and how it affects the people who work in fashion supply chains. So I'm going to hand over to Nirvana now, who can kind of introduce the rest of the panel and kick us off. Thank you so much, Nirvana.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Hello, everyone. As Rachel mentioned, I'm Nirvana Mujtaba, Women's Rights Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Oxfam Canada. I'm very excited to join this session with our esteemed panelists. I'm joining from the traditional territory of 5 Indigenous communities: Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Mississauga. Let me start by introducing our great panelists here. Beira Triastian is a program manager at Trend Asia, an environmental NGO based in Indonesia. Dr. Hakan Karosman is a social scientist focusing on climate action and social justice in fashion supply chains. Hakan is an assistant professor at Cardiff University and the current chair of Union of Concerned Researchers in Fashion. His current research project, Fashion's Responsible Supply Chain Hub, is an UN-recognized and EU-funded action research project on just transition in the fashion industry. Seema Joshi, our another panelist here, is currently the Fashion and IT Campaigns Director at Stand.earth. At Stand, Seema leads the team's effort to push for a rapid, equitable, and fair decarbonization in these sectors by focusing on advancing effective brand supply chain. Seema has 25 years of experience working on corporate accountability, including from the human rights, legal, and environmental perspectives. She has extensively worked on supply chains, including by creating amongst the first responsible supply chain and due diligence standards. We have Ian Pons, who is the program manager at the UN Climate Change. Ian engages with companies, cities, regions, investors, and civil society to drive transformational action to support implementation of the Paris Agreement. His work has included launching the Global Climate Action Portal, which is now the accountability centerpiece for tracking non-state action requested by the UN Secretary General. He is currently facilitating these actors' participation in the first ever global stock take, a process for countries and stakeholders to determine collective progress against the Paris Agreement goals and chart a way forward for raising ambition and accelerating action, which culminates in COP28 in Dubai, UAE. The global fashion industry is amongst the most climate polluting industries on the planet. As per an Oxfam report, in 1 year, the fashion industry was responsible for 2.5 times as many emissions as 48 countries in Africa combined. But beyond that, it's a microcosm of human rights, climate justice, and biodiversity, which are fundamentally linked. Let's dive into the discussion and learn about the different perspectives on just transition from energy and decarbonization lens, how power systems operates and its challenges, discuss the practical steps of different supply chain actors in ensuring rapid, fair, and equitable transition for the industry from our panelists. So Beira, I'll start with you first. I know that Trend Asia is working to support a just energy transition in Indonesia and across Asia, where the vast majority of garment factories are located. Can you tell us a little bit from your own work experience about why a just energy transition is important, especially in relation to its effect on women and gender equality? Over to you, Beira.
Okay, thank you, Nirvana, for the question. Actually, Trend Asia with Coalition of Bersihkan Indonesia have the standing that we are stand to the principle and guidelines for the equitable and just energy transition in Indonesia that we share on 20 October 2022. And we consider that the energy transition must be process that replace the extractive and centralistic energy supply pattern into regenerative and democratic one. So that is beneficial not only for the society, but also for the environment. We Trend Asia believe that just energy transition is the key. The world has relied on fossil fuel for too many years. In Indonesia, the coal is used not only for the power plant, the coal also applied in industry and other area in massive scale, while the oil and gas utilized mostly for the transportation and household cook. We found that fossil fuel is impacting not only up, but also downstream. Trend Asia is witnessing how bad the impact of the coal, oil, and gas exploitation, which the process devastating the water availability, the air, and also the land. We know that the pollution endangered the environment and social system. We found the relation of many stunting cases happen in many coal mining sites and power plant in Indonesia. Even today, you know, in Jakarta, actually we had like air pollution issue that contributes to respiratory issue, which we know have the same root cause. In Indonesia, vulnerable groups like women, people with disabilities, indigenous tribes, and other groups are frequently impacted by the faulty energy government's policies. From data on 2020, the global greenhouse gas emission in Indonesia mostly comes from energy use in industry sectors. So we know that industrial waste is a serious pollutant for the rivers. One of the river that contaminated by this behavior is the Citarum River. It even once the most polluted river in the world. And our data demonstrate that this vulnerable group were directly impacted by the polluted water. the skin and respiratory problems has been found more in this group actually. So it's a serious problem.
Thank you so much, Bera. I would just also like to mention to our audiences who are listening through that we will be taking questions after the panel discussion. So please use the Q&A button to share your questions. With that, let's move on to Hakan. You've spoken extensively about the harmful social and psychological consequences of fashion's complex supply chains on the garment workers themselves. Can you tell us a little about how these systems and conditions on women and other gender identities? Can you share an example of any fashion brand that is doing things differently to better the situation?
Sure. Thank you so much, Nirvana, and thank you, Rachel, for the invite. And I'm so pleased to be here with fantastic speakers. This is a really timely conversation that we should be having at the moment. Climate change is real. There's no doubt. We need to phase out. This is one goal that we all need to achieve. However, let us remember there are tensions between time-sensitive environmental actions and long-term social consequences. So phasing in renewables or phasing out fossil fuels will have social consequences. Therefore, we need to be conscious about the fact that climate targets need to be integrated with social justice principles. But just transitions are not easy. Decarbonization projects are quite context specific, so we can't really create one-size-fits-all approaches. We need to understand cultural values and also local knowledge. And indigenous people, workers, people that are in the field have this tacit knowledge that we should cherish. Therefore, social dialogues are the most important thing to ensure just transitions, for which representation and inclusion are important, and they are great antecedents. So how can we bring this overarching concept into an industry which is characterized by labor-intense supply chains? The fashion industry is full of paradoxical tensions. On the one hand, we have climate actions and climate targets, but on the other hand, supply chain strategies are driven by cost reduction and lead time pressure. On the one hand, we talk about climate change and emission reduction targets, but on the other hand, overproduction is the biggest problem that we need to be talking about. So now let's bring this down to the worker level. The supply chains are mostly women supply chain workers in the fashion industry. So we are talking about 80% of the workforce at the tier 1 level is female. So they are really labor intense and they are really important skill sets that we should be cherishing. However, because of the infrastructure and because of the imbalanced power relationship, suppliers are not empowered, and therefore workers are feeling the consequences in terms of psychological and physical impact of the fashion companies' operational strategies. I will give more examples. I'm conscious of time. I will try to summarize, but then please come back with questions. But infrastructures across fashion supply chains are old in many factories. And most of the countries are actually hitting the rock bottom in terms of climate change, because every year they are breaking records in terms of temperature increase. So having this in mind, let's talk about the infrastructure. These factories are old. The workers are already working so hard, and they are dealing with production schedules that are inhuman because of overproduction and changing collections every single week. This paradoxical situation, in addition to heat and flooding risks and all other climate hazards and risks, are actually adding on top of psychological impact that workers are already facing. How can we actually tackle this? We need investments and we need responsible purchasing practices. Yes, workers are affected, and most of these workers are women, and they work at the, I will repeat, supply chains are quite different, but if you look at the tier 1, which is cut and sew operations, they are mostly female workforce. But then when we move toward fabric and yarn making, we talk about really big machines, and those machines are really hot, especially in summertime. So infrastructures are old and machines need to be equipped and need to be renewed, but these are requiring really big investments that not everyone actually can afford to. And lastly, let's not forget about the farmers or informal workers that work in the supply chains that are still not considered in fashion supply chains in the traditional sense. So I'm expecting everyone, brands included, to set climate targets with social issues in the center. We can't separate climate justice from social justice. They are inseparable, and these workers have ideas and an understanding about what they need and how these problems can be tackled. We conduct action research, we do ethnography, so we speak with the communities, and the amount of innovation that they have, the level of ideas and sophistication of those ideas are actually quite important to tackle and to understand, but they are silenced because questions and the setting that we are operating in now don't involve representation and inclusion. So we can't tackle just transition in today's setting. We need to have grassroots and bottom-up approaches in which workers and suppliers must be put front and center. And you asked me if there's anyone with great ideas or different examples. Yes, there are interesting social innovation, but I will invite you to take a look at the lower tiers. So yes, let's talk about the brands, but also let's bring exemplars from lower tiers, because especially social innovation happens at where fashion is produced, which is a manufacturing plant. And there are so many fantastic women-led initiatives. And also at the fabric level, there are so many interesting material innovation. This is why it is important to bring those exemplars to the spotlight. And if we are asked to give a specific brand example, I will invite you to take a look at the purpose-driven brand. There are so many brands that try to actually bring people in the center, and they actually enable their supply chain partners flourish. That's why the way they approach their business model is quite different. So I will differentiate the question around who is actually purpose-driven and who is profit-driven. And profit-driven companies are looking for easy fixes, but those incremental actions will not help us take climate change with justice. We need to be conscious of purpose and social justice for everyone. Nirvana, you are muted.
Sorry, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hakan. That was very informative. Seema, if I can move on to you. At Stand.earth, you lead campaigns asking the brands themselves to cut their emissions and phase out fossil fuels. Action in the supply chain is insufficient. Can you tell us more about what brands are or aren't doing currently in terms of climate justice? And what specific actions should they be taking to ensure a more equitable and rights-based supply chain?
Thank you, Nirvana, and thanks to Hakan and Berat, because they've done such a great job at setting the stage for to talk about brands and the brand responsibility. So I think it is very important to start off by saying that no action by brands when it comes to taking responsibility for their supply chains does not mean that the brand is acting is neutral, and actually the brands are harmful, you know, in that way, when they are either refusing to make commitments to decarbonize their supply chains, or actually taking additional steps to ensure that in practice, a decarbonization process is happening. So that's about the decarbonization. And then of course, what has been laid out before us, it's not just about the what, it's not just about the, I guess, the cutting emissions, it's the how this is done. And I mean, just to say, I think this is really, I agree, it's a really timely moment because, you know, we do need to have some rapid action in this industry happen, and we need brands, many brands, not just one or two stepping forward to actually take effective action. We need it all to happen, and we need to happen, it to happen now. I mean, I want to take a step as to how brands are doing. I mean, the main, I guess, sort of method of evaluation or benchmarking that at Stand.earth that we have done over the last couple of years is really to produce a scorecard, which we call the fossil-free fashion scorecard. And we produced one earlier this year in March. The scorecard itself, which there's a link on our website, there are 43 companies that essentially that we have evaluated according to 5 criteria. And those 5 criteria range from making, it's all based on what is publicly available. And I think this is very key, because if we're talking about inclusion and being deliberately inclusive, if we don't have publicly available information as to what brands are doing, we're already making it an exclusive process. And we're essentially solidifying this power imbalance, which we know currently exists in the sector. So with the most recent scorecard, 43 companies were essentially assessed. So I was saying there's 5 criteria. One was making a public commitment to decarbonize the supply chain by going 100% to renewable energy, so wind and solar in particular. Another criteria, we're looking at disclosure of the energy mix. So what is the energy mix? Coal, and renewable, is that actually publicly available? Looking at information around our reliance on fossil fuel fabrics, such as polyester, which we know actually is encouraging a demand, yet another demand for fossil fuel for more production, if you want to say, and also looking at carbon that's associated with transportation, and also looking at corporate advocacy. So how much are brands taking a position, requesting, for example, decision makers, governments to really support decarbonization, either through the passing of laws, policies, and other types of enabling factors. So the state of play is, unfortunately, it is disappointing. We had 51% of those 43 companies received a grade of a D, 32% received a grade within the C range. One company received a B-, which was the highest score. And then 6 companies actually received a grade of an F. So I just wanted to start there by saying that it is, even though we're looking at the what and not the how, the progress has been disappointing so far. However, I want to also say that actually in our next scorecard, we also would like to have a criteria that is looking at the just transition specifically. So looking at aspects of the how, which also makes this conversation incredibly timely, because what the indicators of what we're looking for are particularly key. And I think that's great to even bring those out in those conversations, because we must match the what with the how, and this is the moment to do it. So it's, I do feel that, we have had conversations with brands that potentially are watching this webinar, and they may be engaging through conversations. There are brands that are committed, right, that actually want to take action to decarbonize. And I think this point of the how, it will be very timely and really interesting to see how much this is taken forward and taken up. We do have some brands already that have signed on to, let's say, legal agreements, such as the International Accord, which has come from the Bangladesh Accord. We know that the Pakistan, Accord is there as well. And I think that actually this is encouraging, while that's looking at workers and conditions for workers, that's pretty significant. And this is a big part of also the how, but for me, it is a positive signal in the sense that actually brands have done this type of, the ones that have signed up to, the International Accord, actually, it gives a signal that they're also open to really actually looking at other indicators that will ensure that there is a just transition. So I think, what we need to really see is effective action. We don't want to see false solutions. I know this webinar is also about false solutions. We want solutions that essentially have impact and that matter. So they matter from not only a climate perspective, they matter from an environmental perspective, as Bara has brought out, impacts on the local environment as well as on people. And we can talk about that maybe potentially later in the Q&A as to what false solutions, what does that mean? What are these false solutions? How do we ensure that we sort of protect and take action against them? Actions that brands can take, as I said, is to actually, they have a lot of leverage and power. I think this is very clear. Brands should use their leverage and power and actually act responsibly when it comes to pushing forward, I'm going to say this decarbonization process in the right manner. So that looks like not only making these ambitious commitments, for example, decarbonize 100% decarbonization by 2030, I would say it also means publishing a pathway. There should be a pathway, and that pathway, actually, the brand should invite suppliers, to basically be part of building those pathways. And the suppliers, therefore, should also ensure that representatives from workers, groups, unions are actually involved in that as well. So we're not missing anything in that pathway, and we're actually feel more confident that it will lead to the results on various levels and perhaps address the tensions that Hakan mentioned. We can actually, recognize there may be tensions that already exist, and we essentially deliberately advance a strategy to ensure that we are ensuring that we're addressing those attention. So I think that the pathway is one piece. We actually need brands to not support suppliers, but also work with suppliers, in this process. We need to, for example, one way to, I guess, enter as partners, shift power, could be around sort of longer term agreements, relationships between brands and suppliers, ensuring that actually as part of that pathway, all of the aspects are considered. For example, initial costs, investment that is needed. It's come up previously, investment for what specific aspects, and what does that look like up front? So I'm gonna stop there, but brands have I think the bottom line is that there is a shared responsibility here. We need to have a pathway, and we need to ensure there's deliberate inclusion in the process as it happens now. And that does not mean slowing it down. That means actually making sure that the action we're taking is more effective.
Thank you so much, Seema. That was very interesting, and especially how you explained about it's not only cutting emissions, but it's also about how the emissions are being reduced. Ian, I will move on to you, and I wanted to kind of ask you, the Fashion Charter is convened by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but led by companies, including both brands and suppliers. Can you speak to us about how you see brands responding to the issue of just transition and key areas of agreement and disagreement between brands and suppliers? And how do these align with human rights considerations?
Yeah, thank you so much. And first of all, again, thank you for the invitation for this panel. And already, Seema mentioned, and also Seema herself, there's a lot of already really good substance here, and a lot of things that I would love to follow up on, and probably can't in this first intervention that I'll have. But I think just on the Fashion Industry Charter, this is, it is a charter of over 100 signatories, and across 23 countries, and they're right now already starting to begin talking about just transition. It is both from the brands and supplier side, this issue has come up. However, as Seema mentioned, others mentioned, the how to do that is a thing that's going to be really fundamental to do this. But it is becoming a central issue, and will be part of the work program going forward. On this idea of what are the general agreements between the different stakeholders, I think there's general agreement on the what, right? But it is the how that's different. So on the what, there's like increasing convergence on this idea to have fair and safe working conditions, and same goals for importance on reducing the environmental impact, whether that be reducing waste, water usage, sustainable materials and manufacturing processes. But also the third aspect, increasing transparency, which Seema mentioned in supply chains, whether that be on how products are being produced, location, origins of materials. So there is this general convergence and agreement of what needs to be addressed. But to be honest, the disagreement is how to get there. And I think this is what this panel is going to try and unpack over the next little bit, is how do we work together, brands, suppliers, and all stakeholders across the value chain, and go away from our silos and have really constructive discussions on how do we achieve that. This idea, and it was mentioned already, like, suppliers want to decarbonize, that they want to, let's say, new manufacturing plans, but that needs investment, that needs capital expenditure, and that takes time. And so they need some sort of assurance that if they go ahead with this, that brands and companies who are using these suppliers, that they will stick around, and that even if they go through this transition, it needs to be rapid. But at the end of the day, that if they do it, that it won't harm them in the long run. So again, the right investments, the right capital expenditures, and also the aspect which is touched upon a little bit also, what do we actually value as a society? Is it just monetary cost? What about costing out the environmental impact, the impact on workers, the impact on local communities? Again, like we can have a whole different discussions on shifting economic paradigms, but I think this idea of just monetary cost as the success indicator needs to change. And again, it's just really about looking at this whole idea of sustainability is really complex. It's and in this world, there's a huge supply chains, value chains that need to be that are interacting on a daily basis. And to solve these challenges, it's really complex. And there's, as Hakan mentioned, there's not a one-size-fits-all situation. We really need to be looking at tailoring these different solutions to the different contexts. And this is where, honestly, going into possible solutions around this is something in the climate world that we're always grappling. To be honest, it's really just this agreement about how everyone needs to take climate action, but no one needs to be left behind. And how do we make sure that everyone is treated equitably and in this transition? So this idea of access to finance, technology, capacity building, this is a common themes across the climate world, and it also applies to the fashion industry. So again, it's this idea of like, everyone talks about the cost of renewable energy going down globally, but how much of that potential is actually being deployed in developing countries, and at what scale, and making sure that they benefit from this transition, not be left behind. Also, this idea of having to make sure that if workers are supposed to benefit from this transition, they need the skills and the learnings to do so, this capacity building. But if they get this capacity building, is it retained and sustainable in the long term? That overall, that as we go through this transformation over the next decade, we'll be even accelerating even further transformation as we go forward. But how do we make sure that workers and local communities can benefit this transformation as we go on? And so overall, I think there's two things I just want to touch on now of how we can change this. And I think it's already been touched upon by the previous speakers, but this idea of inclusivity, and people mentioned it, how this idea of meaningful and dialogue and authentic exchange that involves everyone, all across the value chain, from the brands all the way down to the suppliers to the local communities around the decision-making table. We talk about that all the time, but how often have we actually done that? And I think, to be honest, it seems like a simple step, but it's really a fundamental step to really have, and it was mentioned by how this social dialogue, a meaningful, authentic social dialogue. And that's the only way that we can have this transformation that is equitable for all. We need to be on the ground in those countries, in developing countries, to know those world. Okay, yeah, these boilerplate templates of what to do, but is it so easy, whether that be in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other countries? There's differences between these different countries, and we need to make sure that we are on the ground and listening to those voices. This last thing I'll point out is, it was touched upon too, is the need to ensure that this is there's an integrated and holistic approach. For us, being from the UN, climate action is not a silo. Climate action needs to be anchored in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are particular elements which people don't necessarily realize in the Paris Agreement, that this climate action needs to also eradicate poverty, allow developing countries to develop sustainably, whether that be food, water security, energy access. And so these elements are not supposed to be done in silos. It needs to be anchored in sustainable development. And the only way that we can do that is to make sure that all the needs across not just climate, but also whether that be human rights, whether that be through other aspects of sustainable development, are all considered when we take climate action to ensure this transition is just. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian. Well, we understand, like, we've had this conversation from our panelists here, that there's no one size fits all rule sets that can be applied for a just transition across different regions and contexts. Bera and Hakan, we would be interested to hear from you about what are the main challenges from your perspective to achieving a rapid, fair, and equitable transition. Bera, it would be great if we could start with you.
Okay, thank you. So actually, I think the most challenging aspect for the just transition that we face in Indonesia, especially for the energy sector, actually the process is so far to transparent and participative, as already mentioned by Dr. Karosman, Sima, and also Ian. Actually, the idea of inclusivity is not, we should just push them at not only just the idea. Actually, it's really hard to be more inclusive in each process in Indonesia, especially. So actually, the system in Indonesia, and I know in Bangladesh also in different country, they have a same issue that the system makes energy as a topic that is exclusive and extremely technocratic, especially in Indonesia. Actually, everyone, even they use electricity or another energy for their daily lives, it's really hard to reach the issue. So every group who affected by the transition should be participate and have the right to decide what best for them. So I know that we believe that every transition will affecting the social stability, so that the regulation should come first before other technical aspect in transition plan. So in Indonesia, it's like they come with many ideas how to do this and that. So the planning just coming without even asking the society who live at the places. So I know that we believe in Train Asia and many CSO in Indonesia, we try to push this issue should cover by aspect and we need to apply the free, prior, informed, and consent. So it's like we know the aspect is really important, because in here in Indonesia, especially when we talk about just transition, especially for energy, it just they just focusing on transition itself. We don't really transforming the energy from the fossil fuel to the renewables one, like Sima said and notified that we should push them to the renewable one, because we believe the renewable energy is better for everyone. But even in Indonesia, we have the false solution in many cases. Not only so the fossil fuel, especially for the industry sector, actually we know that some of the company or factory, they're committed to change from the fossil fuel to the renewable one, but they choose biomass. So I believe biomass is one of the false solution in Indonesia, because the time to burn the biomass is not equal than when we try to plan it. So it's like it's really hard actually to push them to understand what renewable really is in Indonesia. Not only it will I could say the biomass and fossil fuel, especially for the coal power plant, or maybe in industry who use the coal for the fuel, actually has a similar issue that when we burn something, it changes the environment. So it affecting in many cases. It's like we know, like I said before, we evidence that some places in the coal mining industry or industry which using coal as the fuel, actually they have a different and devastating environment. It's not really healthy for everyone. It's like the water is changed, the air is changed, it's polluting everywhere, and it changed the behavior of the people who live surrounding it. So it's like we know it's not good for everyone. Even I know one of the places is really close by my house, actually. And it's really hard to understand that every time we inhale a really high amount of the carbon, and if you know, in Indonesia today, it's really hard to even breathe in Jakarta, because one who came back from the coal power plant in my office, especially, they came back and they are just get sick. So we had the respiratory problem is everywhere. It's not only 1 or 2 person. Actually, is many cases happen in Indonesia. Even the governments, they agree that the air is not even livable. The city is not livable today. And it's like, I could say it's not only that. In many places, like in my city in Bandung, it's not too far from Jakarta. Actually, it's not too far from the biggest textile industry. I'm living nearby them, and it's like, I could say for 20 years, I never see a clean river in my city, because it changed everything. I know the river is always comes blue, and today and tomorrow maybe red, and the other day is different color. It's terrible, actually. So I could say it's really hard, because everyone should be inclusive. I believe the real problem is how to make it really inclusive to everyone, who that everyone has the same rights to decide what best for them. I think that. Thank you, Nirvana.
Thank you, Vera. Hakan, if you could share a few words.
Of course. Well, Bea, thank you very much. It was fantastic, and I can hear you until the end of time. So wonderful. And Donna Marshall, my ride or die in academia, we have conducted a research on just transition based on other industries and based on the countries. And we actually analyzed up to 100 papers to really see what failed in just transition. And I have some bullet points. And this is not specifically about the fashion industry, because fashion still just transition is not happening. So we can learn from what failed in other industries and in other countries. So then we can take some lessons learned for the fashion industry to create that evidence-based pathways. Number one, lack of inclusive decision-making. So in all failed just transitions, unfortunately, people that are affected are never included in decision-making. And those that set targets or decisions or strategies always favor one topic over another, and they actually frame the issue. So either policymakers and industry, or in tandem, so they just hijack conversations to just cherry pick certain things that will work for them. And lastly, lack of reflexive and participatory social dialogues. So we need to ensure everyone are involved in these dialogues. So many just transition projects failed, but also so many projects succeeded. And when we look at the successful cases, we see 3 main characteristics. Again, decentralized decision-making with community-driven actions and engaging marginalized communities into just transitions from the beginning of time. How can we translate this into the fashion context? Number one, workers in this current setting are always left behind. They actually are never heard. And one thing that I wanted to underline, also Ian made this important point, skills are important, and we need more skills than ever about circularity, about decarbonization. But workforce doesn't want to work in the fashion industry. Young generation doesn't want to be employed by this industry where there is no justice and fairness for the workers. So how are we going to sustain the workforce, and how we are going to build the new skill set? We need to start with these conversations with the people. So unfortunately, fashion industry is losing the workforce, but fashion is labor intensive. So they need to ensure they actually future is contingent on the workforce. And lastly, I also wanted to touch upon purchasing practices. Unfortunately, power relations are so imbalanced, brands are not sharing their profits and financial power. So everything starts with purchasing practices, responsible purchasing and living wage. We cannot expect suppliers to pay the living wage to their workers if cost reduction strategies take place by the brands. So this, unfortunately, the traditional business model and decarbonization don't sit well. We need to challenge the industry through the business model renovation. And lastly, I want to say one thing. We really should attach with the workers emotionally. Workers are always so left behind that emotionally. Brands are so detached from the reality. Let's be in the field. Let's speak to the workers. Let's speak to the suppliers. Those solutions, pathway, principles exist. We just need to listen and create an inclusive pathway by those lessons that we will learn from the suppliers. Brands don't have solutions because brands don't have technical knowledge. Technical knowledge and tacit knowledge lie at the supply chain levels. And I will give one final example. I know I'm talking so much, but this is one final example. Fashion design must go back to the function. We need to make sure quality products with durable materials and durable design actually will be in sync with circularity and sustainability. We cannot push for decarbonization when fashion design teams are still coming up with design ideas that will make suppliers consume water, chemicals, and everything. When I was in the field last year for my action research, I can tell you at least up to 20 examples in which everything was just so delusional. On the one hand, we are looking for climate targets, but on the other hand, those internal conversations at the brand level must be challenged. So I invite fashion brands to create internal functional meetings with their designs and then extend those meetings to the supply chain partners to learn from them. So then actually those knowledge that we will gain from the lower tiers will be informing fashion design. So that top-down approaches don't work, and decarbonization is all about inclusive dialogues, not top-down arrogance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hakan. Just realizing that we have a little bit more than 10 minutes. I would like to ask, I'd like to speak to Seema and Ian about another question that I have here, that a just energy transition is ultimately about creating systemic change rather than simply replacing one energy source with another while leaving existing power systems in place. In this context, what do brands, companies, or governments need to do to change existing power dynamics, and what should they be replaced with to support the rights and well-being of workers, particularly for the women who make our clothes? Ian, if we could please start with you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. And I think there's so many things that have been touched upon already. I in this context, maybe 2 or 3 things that I just want to highlight here. It goes back to this idea of the changing the paradigm, to going back to changing what we value. And Hakan mentioned this earlier about this way that, let's say in developing countries, like citizens, local communities, and indigenous peoples are already doing things that are inherently sustainable. We just don't label it that way, or it doesn't get valued. But they're already doing things, and why are they not? I don't want to use the word compensate, but why are they not rewarded or benefiting from that? Because it doesn't have the label of circular economy principles. They're already doing that. So I think this idea of changing what people are doing, I'm so happy this is a common theme of like really getting down on the ground of what people are doing, really into that context to understand what is valuable for those communities. So that's one thing I want to mention. The other aspect of this idea of really this changing power dynamics is this systems approach, like this systems wide approach, rather than just looking at energy in a vacuum, for example, which Beria mentioned really well. So we need to look at the energy system across sectors, across systems, and across stakeholder groups. And I was really resonated with the fact that, and we mentioned a lot of times that Beria, which you mentioned, which really resonated, is that idea of inclusivity is hard. And I never thought about that before. We always say it's easy to do, we do it, but it's really hard actually to design systems and inclusive dialogues that really is meaningful and that really all the stakeholders have a decision-making table. We all know that, and let's be honest, like we're all involved, like we do this in every day, whether it be projects, every decision we make, we want to be collaborative, we want to be inclusive, make sure everything goes, everyone's taking account, but that's hard. And so let's be acknowledged and credible as well that as much as we're trying to be inclusive, that we need to be realistic too, to make sure that we also practice what we preach every day. So again, thank you, Barry, for that, because that just resonated with me quite a bit. But this idea of pathways as well, I think this is really important that, yes, we have these global pathways, let's say towards 2030 or 2050, but these pathways need to be regionalized and localized. So if we have those guiding principles of what can be done to the energy system, these should be tailored to the regional context and according to their needs. But that shouldn't stop us coming up with these pathways. And I think this idea of innovation, of trying things and being okay to fail, I think we're at that point now. We just can't wait for that perfect solution. But of course, we don't want any more damaging solutions that harm things. But I think we just need to be all together, this idea of really innovating, willing to fail and come up and changing things quickly. But the last thing I'll point out, which changing the power dynamics, which I think Seema mentioned as well, is this importance of transparency and accountability. Because, and this is what the Paris Agreement does, it's really this idea of transparency and putting this public data out there using kind of a bottom-up approach, which people said, okay, that won't work, but we also can't have a top-down, where we're actually telling other countries what to do. But this idea of transparency and accountability and making sure that whatever people are doing, whatever their plans they have in place, they also report back on their progress on a regular and periodic basis to make sure that if they're okay, if they're achieving their plans, but also as well, if they're not achieving our plans, let's not just completely start finger pointing. Let them actually be honest of the barriers they're facing and help them achieve them. So it's kind of a balance to make sure that of the carrot stick approach, to make sure that we're transparent, hold people to account, but also help them and support them to overcome those challenges. And really for the just transition piece, and this is something from the UN perspective that we're pushing, and especially it's very timely because today is this the week of the UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit, where there's a big push of not only coming up with plans or goals or targets, but really come up with just robust and credible transition plans. So people need to put that on the table. So in order to show how people are going to implement it and then report progress on that. And that applies to countries, companies, cities, suppliers, brands, again, tailored to their context. Some may move quicker, some may move faster, but it's really important to have those plans in place so that we can track where we're going. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Seema, would you like to share your thoughts?
So I don't want to sort of restart. It makes me think we definitely need to have a part 2 of this seminar. I mean, I want to say a few things to just, I really appreciate, Bara, your firsthand sharing of the impacts, because I feel like actually this is what we need to keep reminding all of the actors in the supply chain, right? And particularly when we're looking at brands and consumers who buy from those brands and, you know, those lawmakers, you know, I do feel that, you know, people forget, you know, exactly where their goods come from, who's making it, what's been the impact of it. And it's not that I was having a conversation with I've had some interesting conversations, which I'll just share quickly. One with a 17-year-old, and, you know, she was asking what I did for a living. And I basically said, oh, you know, we're looking at fashion and we're looking at decarbonization. And we really feel like, you know, this should be done in a proper way. It should be done rapidly, equitably. And she did not know, you know, the stories behind the labels, right? She doesn't know, you know, like actually what is the impact of the fashion industry? And that goes back to this point about transparency and regulation and laws. You know, they're very clear incentives for companies to start to do due diligence, which we know there's legislation coming in. We know that actually, unfortunately, we're living in a world where those are required to get the systemic changes that we need. So I feel hopeful that since there are so many regulations on the table, for example, in the EU, I know they're still being sorted out, but a lot of these brands are basically either trading within the EU, trading to the EU, or based in the EU. And we know that in the United States that there's certain laws that are basically coming forward. I just feel that actually this provides the opportunity for us to really sort of really envision the fact that actually we do need to do it differently. The current business model, I think it's actually in one of the international panel on climate changes reports that talk about the economic system is broken. I know capitalism has come up in the chat. I just feel like this is, what we need to ensure that as a group of us that we have power and we use that power to basically use our influence, our leverage to ensure that actually deliberate inclusion is working. I think there are ways that we can do this and bring them into powerful conversations. The one specifically I was thinking of, for example, we know brands are all part of the UN Fashion Charter. There should be efforts. This is a brand-led initiative is as I see it and understand it. We should ensure that there is transparency, in that process itself, that actually there are deliberate efforts made to get inputs, not just from civil society, but also the local civil society like BERA, who are working with communities, and people who are directly impacted. So I feel like, yes, systemic change is needed. We have an opportunity right now to do it. We have power. We need to use it. We need a brand to come forward and actually be courageous enough to start putting, putting this right and center. I think we live in a profit-driven world. I think this is a harsh reality. But the more we see actually brands being incentivized to basically perhaps engage and show that they're doing a decarbonization, in a just, fair, equitable manner. My hope is that if that's what's needed to basically get the shift, the systemic shift, then that's what we need to basically look at doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. It was wonderful to hear from all of you, and to what we gathered from the discussion today of brands have a responsibility to take action where the status quo continues to inflict dangerous harm on the people and planet. And brands should actually act responsibly and put forward the decarbonizing process in the correct manner. And really, the conversation around publishing a pathway is a very interesting way to look forward and see how brands can make sure that the worker voices are centered in these discussions and how they're reflected through achieving the goals. And should not be left behind decarbonization. It's also looking into about the purchasing practices of the brands and need to make sure that the power imbalance is not prevalent. And also looking into, Hakan, I really liked where you mentioned that brands need to also share their profits and really brought into light practices. Ambitions isn't enough, and climate targets need to be achieved with the social issues, keeping the social issues into the center. And just transition needs to include more of a bottom-up approach where workers and suppliers must be included. Well, suppliers and workers need to be actively included in the discussions and decisions that impact them. And this has come over again throughout the conversation that we've had today, that actions need to have an equity-centered approach and be inclusive, leaving no one behind. And regulations, on the other end, is very important to make systemic changes. We've seen over the years that voluntary mechanisms don't always work positively, and there needs to be actual legislation and regulations in place so that there can be systemic changes. And overall, negotiating the living wages and long-term contracts and the financially supporting the actors and the suppliers and the workers within the fashion supply chain is really critical to becoming more sustainable. It was an extremely interesting discussion where we learned about the idea of inclusivity and meaningful dialogue with the authentic exchange of the worker voices and the supplier voices and all over the supply chain. And overall, what we think to what we've discussed today as to make the fashion supply chain, it has sustainable, it has become really critical towards making the fashion industry sustainable. We need a fair and equitable transition towards living wages, clean energy, and a safe environment. Thank you so much. I will hand it over to Rachel to help us with the question and answer session now.
Thank you so much, Nirvana, for your skillful guiding of this conversation. I think it was so interesting. I'm honestly regretting opening it to public Q&A because I have so many questions. But we will start. I wanted to kick off just, we have a ton of questions come in from the audience. And I kind of wanted to open with maybe a big question, which is an opportunity for everybody or anybody to jump in. And that is the big elephant in the room in every fashion discussion that I've been involved in so far, which is around degrowth. And what do you see as the role of degrowth and ending overproduction models in fostering this just transition that encompasses environmental sustainability, economic equity, and social justice? And, I would love to hear from any of you, Nirvana absolutely included. Please go for it. Anyone who wants to jump in? Seema, please.
I think a few people mentioned this. I mean, I actually really going to start off being controversial. I think that, overproduction, yes, it is a massive issue. I'd like to see sort of active policy measures or legal measures focused at penalizing waste. I think it's come up here, like to put a value. I think, Ian, you mentioned it, like start putting a value on sort of the social environmental impacts. I feel like actually we need to start penalizing waste and the harmful impacts of waste and how much waste there is, because I think, whether or not the way we take it on, I think that will align even nicely with the just transition, because when we have overconsumption, that's in what we call the global north, isn't it? That's where the primary issues are. And we know that actually the waste is in the global south. So also from an equity perspective, if we could get to a point where we're actually quantifying that and actually penalizing, disincentivizing it, it would be incredible and perhaps lead us into a direction where we're actually giving more value to what is produced.
Please go ahead, Hakan.
Sure. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Seema, for the fantastic opening. I want to build from, to me, degrowth is still not understood well. So there's this lack of perception about degrowth. And I don't think people necessarily understand what degrowth really means theoretically and how it can be actually operationalized. But degrowth doesn't necessarily mean job reduction. It always brings that negative association, but actually degrowth is a planned reduction of the economic activity to keep human activity within safe planetary boundaries. And if you saw the report last week, now we have officially crossed 6 planetary boundaries. So we need to change the way we do things. So degrowth is all about sharing resources evenly in terms of social, human, and natural resources, and also economic resources, so then people in the system can flourish. To me, when I'm reading especially indigenous theories and people from the global south, I understand one thing. We have a mismatch between objective and outcome, and I keep talking about this all the time, but I think we need to accentuate. Degrowth is an outcome. If we create a proper strategy, if we actually bring everything together around prosperity, the way we do things will enable people to flourish, and then the human activity will be safe in that operational space where resources will be shared. But if we put degrowth as the objective, then this is where the trouble starts. So this global north versus global south in terms of indigenous theories and understanding is actually quite lacking. And I'm aware that it is a difficult concept, but it is not something scary. We just need to understand and explain that better to make sure it is a central facet of the pathway approach we will take at the system level.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. It was really interesting addition to conversation. So I have a few questions here. Sorry. So an interesting question here around says that some factories in Vietnam have raised the factory temperature from 26 degrees to 28 degrees in response to energy efficiency needs. So when we ask for GHG emissions reduction, demands may be hurting workers on the front lines. And this is a question which I think has broader resonance really around how climate change and workers' rights can be balanced. And I would love to hear from anyone, maybe Nirvana would like to come in. Yeah, Hakan, please. Or, yeah.
Sorry, I just talked so much, but it is a scientific research which I also came across, and I also saw this from my own observations. Many suppliers have reduction targets set by the brands. So in order to meet the reduction targets set by the brands, some suppliers don't prefer to put air conditioners in the facility, in the manufacturing plants. So then they are, unfortunately, the indoor temperature is actually increasing. And there's a beautiful report, which I will send on the chat box, that was published last week, is actually talking about this, heat and floods in manufacturing factories and countries. And we are seeing that many suppliers, because of the GHG emission reductions set by the brands, are not able to do things for their workers. This brings us to the conversation where workers are hurt and how we can help workers. And who set those targets is a big question. So again, brands set those targets, but we need to make sure this is a joint conversation.
Nirvana, let's go to you next.
I'd like to just add, I think that was the main conversation throughout the discussion that we had, that whenever we're setting targets, we need to be inclusive and it needs to be equity-centered overall, making sure that there are no power imbalances throughout the decisions that we've made. So brands have made those decisions, but how it is actually being affected by the workers working in the factory, what the working conditions are there proper flow of air? Is there enough water? What is the situation overall within the workers? Because they're standing all day on 2 feet without any cover and anything. So there are a lot of factors to really consider when we're looking into cutting emissions, and being inclusive and really speaking and making sure that the worker voices are heard is something very important in this aspect. And another thing that I also want to kind of bring in is that whenever we're looking into, I think the transparency conversation came in, and really having that transparent approach about how they reach to their targets and having those conversations and really supporting their suppliers to reach those emissions. It shouldn't be, we are in a world where we're talking about decolonization. It shouldn't be a top-down approach from the brand's perspective. It should be an approach where the suppliers are included into discussions, the workers are included into discussions, and all these discussions also need to be transparent about how they have reached that way. Thank you.
Thanks. Ian.
Yeah, I guess Nirvana was kind of hinted out what I was going to say there. This idea of just having these targets for suppliers and their scope 3 emissions or whatever. I think it's really important that if they're putting certain targets there, that it's not just something where they impose that. They do provide some sort of resources and investment to help these suppliers to achieve these targets, and these should be joint targets, joint collaborative targets that aren't just done top down. So I think that's and we get this throughout, whether that be brands, suppliers, or across anywhere climate action, that targets, okay, setting plans and targets, that's hard. But what's even harder is implementing those. And I think it gets even harder when you start trying to impose those, or saying that it's in developing countries or part of your supply chain where you don't have the knowledge or the expertise or the needs of what's going on in a local community. So I think this idea of inclusion, collaborative approaches, joint decision making is really critical, but also to ensure that the resources and finance and investment, and whether that be technologies and capacity building, is actually provided for these suppliers and stakeholders in developing countries to actually achieve what they want to achieve. Again, what we've heard, the desire is there within the developing countries and suppliers, but they just don't necessarily have the resources, expertise to do so. And I think it's the responsibility for all of us here, and especially ones in developing countries, to really try and help with that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really interesting conversation there. I wanted to pick up quickly on a point that Hakan raised earlier around a living wage, and maybe kind of open this up to the panel around the role that a living wage has in this decarbonization question, and how the panelists see those things connecting. Yeah, Nirvana, please.
I'm sorry, whenever I'm hearing about living wages, somehow it rings a bell because that's one of my core work areas that I'm looking at. Well, living wages is something very important as we're moving into a more just energy transition. Workers are actually earning, the women who make our clothes earn about $4 to $11 per hour compared to thousands of dollars that the employees and staffs and others are making within the industry or within brands and everything. And this amount is not sufficient for these workers, because a living wage needs work. It should be an amount that is able to cover the cost of living, like nutritious food, utilities, healthcare, childcare, transportation. And after all these, there needs to be a sufficient amount of money so that the workers are able to save for a discretionary income for whatever they want. They have a sufficient amount of earning, and living wage is a human right. And without paying these living wages, the fashion industry overall is kind of not ensuring that the human rights are in place for these workers. Now, how it is connected with the just energy transition? With the just energy transition, what the plan is, and which is where the discussion on the pathway comes in, which Seema rightly positioned. Once we know the pathway, we would be understanding how much it would be impacting the workers. And the workers really need to understand if there is a skills development that need to do, if there are job layoffs, how will they be actually working and surviving within this economy with poverty wages? Suddenly we're working towards decarbonization, which is extremely important, but then again, that effect might not transcend as well within the workers as much as we have had these discussions amongst the other right holders within the entire supply chain. And it's very important that the living wages are paid to the workers so that they're also able to adapt to any kind of changes and also be prepared for any kind of changes and have that earning in place.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Does anyone want to come in on this question, or should we move forward? Yeah, Hakan, please. And then Seema.
I will be, sorry, Seema, would you like to go first? I just spoke with. Okay, I will be really brief. But one thing that I wanted to say, supply chains are really, really complex. So when we talk about the garments, we talk about embroidery, printing, fabric, yarn, everything. So the purchasing practices should be fair, and brands really need to pay what is the real worth. So we don't need to reduce costs because it comes at the expense of the workers. And lastly, I want to say one thing. The fashion industry is still driven by the sample production, which is a really old-fashioned way of doing things. If we are to tackle climate change, decarbonization, please, designers, use your creative skills to create things without physical sample, because 10 of those samples that are ordered to the suppliers, I will say 80% don't go on full production, but the brands don't actually bear the costs, but it comes at the expense of the workers, suppliers, all lower tiers. So please, let's make sure we are creating a system with a logical sense of circularity and decarbonization at the heart. Thank you.
Rachel, can I come in really quickly? I know we're almost at time. I'm just adding to what's already been said. I think this is all connected to the point of suppliers, brands dictating, or so I've been told by people who work for suppliers that actually brands have incredible, as we know, leverage and power, and can often dictate the terms of the contract currently. And also, that supplier is then including the price, right? So, and this is all connected to, women being underpaid, in the factories, to the air conditioning now being cut. I mean, as part of this, we do need to change the structure of how these deals are made. So actually, as part of the pathway, I do think it's really key to focus on pushing what we could call as long-term partnerships, right, between brands and key suppliers. And then where, there is a shared responsibility under those partnerships to ensure a living wage is met, as well as other indicators, within that, the context of that relationship. So I think this idea of the power shift is really significant for so many reasons. Or sharing the power, let's say. Shifting would be that would be the economic transformation.
Please come in and then.
Sorry, Rachel, if there's no time, and we have to move, I just wanted to share, I'll be very quick on this. Another thing that, during the conversation, we've come across a couple of times, I can Hakan and Abera also mentioned about the responsible purchasing practices of, the responsible purchasing practices of the brands. And it is extremely critical to when these purchasing practices and during the price negotiation with the suppliers or the sourcing factories overall, the labor costs need to be separated. Within all these discussions that is happening, the ring fencing of the wages, of the labor wages, need to be actually ring fenced within the costing, and then the price negotiations need to happen. Because decarbonization is a process, and it will require a significant amount of resource and investment over time, and long-term contracts are very important, but also to make sure that the workers are protected, ensuring that the labor costs are really separated during the price negotiations is also something very critical to ensure that the workers' rights are entailed.
Vera, please do. Please come in.
Okay, I'll be really quick. Actually, it's I would like to share. Actually, in Indonesia, it's I think it's necessary and it's really critical to have the standard of wages for the workers, because in Indonesia, actually, it's I could say 10 or 20 years ago, the factory for the fashion industry is stay in my city in Bandung. It's not too far from Jakarta. But after the wages is different in Indonesia. It's each region has different standard of wages. So the more I know, I asked my I could say I asked so many friends of mine who still living in my city. Actually, they said the factory, the textile factory and industry for related by it, actually is they changing. I think they are close, but in reality, actually they just move to another city and another region who has lower wages actually in Indonesia. So in Indonesia, even in Indonesia, the standard of wages is really different. Even in Java Island, in the island itself, actually we have a really different standard, maybe more than 10. I mean, it's really different. In Jakarta, you can get maybe 500 to 1,000 dollars, but in different city that the factory move today is they get maybe only 200, I think $200 per month. So it's really different actually. And I know it's the factory just moving to get more profit. So when we have no standard about the wages for the labor, actually it's we just move the problem to another city. Maybe not only in Indonesia, maybe it's we know that the factory is really common in Indonesia back like maybe 10 or 20 years ago. But today's like they're moving to Vietnam or another country who has a lower wages. So that's the reality. I mean, like, I think we need to push the idea how to make it standard in all over the world, not only in Indonesia or maybe certain kind of city or country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Vera. Always great to hear, honestly, have that reminder of what it's like on the ground. And I think I'm gonna move to another question. I wanted to pull on more of this thread around the power dynamic and the power imbalance that we can see and how that relates to the just transition. And then I think maybe it would be great to hear from people about what they think are some practical steps or some real kind of tangible changes that can be made to address this power imbalance and why that matters. Please feel free. Seema, please go for it.
I don't know if anyone else was wanting to go first, but to kick it off, I mean, I think the practical steps, I mean, just to reflect on, I do think this is the importance of producing a pathway, right? And as part of that pathway, bringing in the key actors to develop the pathway, because actually as part of that, you know, it needs to be, you will have this sense of, I believe it will create more of a shared responsibility around the actions that need to be taken in the supply chain broadly. And I think this idea of, you know, really changing, if you want to say, the model around how the transactions are done between brands and suppliers, and perhaps not all suppliers are the same. We know that. I mean, many suppliers in the fashion industry are really big multinationals themselves, right? So, you know, I think as we break it down to different, you know, really get into who the actors are, what responsibilities they have, and actually, you know, where are the, you know, a part of the developing the pathway is also then you're able to really identify the key issues, right? Key issues and areas where actually more focus needs to be paid on or attention paid to, you know, so that we can actually prioritize those types of actions. So I think that practically, I do think it is possible to do this. And I feel like everyone on this call knows it, feels it's possible. I think that we need to, perhaps what's holding it back is that it's not seen as the most profitable way to move forward. Like if this is an industry, which we know is about ultimately selling clothes, shoes, making money, you know, I do feel like that needs to come into this conversation as well. You know, we do need to we need to have all of the changes that we've talked about, but I think that what we need to talk about is actually like, there is actually a case to be made here, right? That actually this is good for business, right? This is good for business because we need to, as I was saying, put a cost, and I think many people brought this idea of a cost on not doing it the way that, you know, we as a group envision that it needs to be done. So I think that's practically what companies can do as a pathway, you know, with those working with companies, ensuring the deliberate inclusion. And then we have this external regulatory framework, people are pushing on that side. I do think that corporate demand, you know, corporate advocacy is really important and really key. Companies cannot be afraid to basically take a position on these issues. And I know that in our work in Stand.earth, we have actually asked companies to take a position on the just energy transition sort of partnerships in Vietnam at the moment, where we know that actually the civil society actors calling for clean energy are being arrested. We know that there has been reluctance by brands to actually come out publicly and to take a position. And that's not just in fashion, but I mean, it's these types of things that we need to keep like pushing for, that this is part of their credibility. It is part of what they need to do in order to be a leader in the industry. And there's a good business case for it.
Yeah, thank you. Really important point there. Yeah, turning it over to Hakan.
And I just kept pasting some links to the chat box. People, please just take a look, because it's about like the power and the trust and some papers that we are we have worked on. One thing that I also wanted to say, power is a theory which I love, and I always work around the power dynamics. So financial power is actually at the brand level, but the technical power is at the supplier level. So we need to make sure technical power is actually cherished and learn from. So we need to make sure the pathways that we will create all together will actually put power as a central facet, because we have so much to learn from suppliers in terms of techniques that will help us to enable just transition. So I just wanted to figure out. Thank you very much.
Ian, please.
Yeah, so those practical steps, again, Barry is so great, because she always says something that really resonates with me, and this idea of, yeah, like job shifting from country to country, and this idea of, I know this is not a practical step, but this is something that we do, this idea of international cooperation and making sure that we have some sort of practical framework that somehow integrates all these initiatives, that we have some way of standards that this can be applicable, so that we're all interconnected. And if this idea of no one leaving behind, that if certain countries are, or certain stakeholders are taking action, how do we make sure that this doesn't have a ripple effect where it impacts all? I don't have a solution for that. I don't claim to have one, but again, we're all saying that we need to achieve this, but I think the practical perspectives, what Beria mentioned, is really important to make sure that we design a framework, whether that's at the international level or at the regional level or within a country itself. We need to make sure that the impacts are considered across stakeholder groups and across different systems and sectors. But yeah, so I just wanted to point that out. But again, that really resonated with me as well.
Thank you so much, Ian. So we are kind of coming to the end of our time, and this has been really just such a fantastic conversation and an instructional panel. I feel like I've learned so much, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to go around each one of the fantastic facilitator and panelists and offer you kind of one last shot, I guess, of what the most important thing that you think our audience should walk away from today. And I'd like to start with Nirvana and then go to Ian, Hakan, Seema, and Beera. That's the order on my screen. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, I think, well, there's no particular, like, not one size fits all rule set that can be applied across just transition or across different regions and contexts. One of the key things that I would like to say and here is that it's very important. We have our climate action in place. We have our human rights agenda in place. We cannot work with these two agendas on silos. They need to be integrated. They need to be inclusive, and they need to be worked together towards achieving the goal. The goals might be different, but it cannot be worked upon in separately or in silos. And really understanding like how we can bring up a more equity-centered approach, and making sure that the workers' voices and the people at the tier, and by worker voices, it comes down to the farmers, the cotton producers within the industry, to really reflect their voices whenever we're bringing in changes within the industry. And that would be one of the very critical things that the brands should be doing. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think the one thing, it was a common theme, is this meaningful, inclusive social dialogue. I think that's the one. Without that, we've all hit on different points of how to do that and different elements of that. Without that, we cannot. That's the foundation for the meaningful just transition. And I think if people go back to the last hour and a half, you'll find practical examples from Hakan, Seema, and Beria, and Nirvana of how to do that. But I think that is the most important thing, to provide that foundation. Is really important, that meaningful, inclusive social dialogue.
I will be.
And for
Oh, sorry.
yeah,
sorry,
yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. it's me first. I don't think so. Please, Hakan, too.
Okay, I will be brief. Thank you, Sarbira. I just want to say to everyone, let's be transparent. We need data. We need transparent and evidence-based data to come up with plans and actions. And the second important thing, which is perhaps the most important, listen to the people. Empathy is the most important thing, and we need to be with the people, workers, suppliers. We need to be in the field, and the information and reality is there to create evidence-based pathways. We need to listen to the people. So let's create this dialogues and make it happen and sustain them. Thank you.
Rachel's screen. My final, I guess, takeaway is that actually we need leadership by brands. I'm going to focus on the brands. We need leadership. We need leadership in this space. We need companies to make 100% commitments and 100% renewable energy in the supply chain done in a just, equitable, inclusive manner. And we really can't delay. We need this target in place by 2030. So I'm putting it out there, like, you know, we need leadership, and we need it now. And we really shouldn't have to rely on laws and regulations. We should actually also have those coming forward with a real template in addition to those laws, regulations, and policy changes.
I think for me, it's like same as everyone. We need to be more like inclusive for everything. It's like, and I agree with Seema. Actually, we need the regulation who will give the access for everyone to get the same, like to be equal. And I need this, like I would like to say that people actually we need to be more we need to implement the access control, participation, and benefits. So I need, like, we need to make sure the access is equal for everyone to get available resources, not only for the workers, suppliers, CSOs, union, everyone. Actually, they should have a similar and equal access, and they need to be they have to having the similar control. Like we need to ensuring all the group have the same opportunity to utilize any kind of resources. And also similar with the inclusivity, we need the participation of everyone, and also the benefit should be used optimally, that all individuals and group can equally and fairly benefit from the development and everything that we use here. Actually, it's like I'm thinking it's like Hakan said, we need to listen to everyone in the ground, that people is not the same. I mean, maybe in the south, in the north and south is really different. I mean, not only in the south and north conflicts in Indonesia itself, in Jakarta and another city is really different. So we need to be more kind, and maybe we need to listen everyone surrounding us, not only far away in the south, but also just near, close by. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that finishing thought. So, I mean, my takeaway, we need meaningful, inclusive social dialogue, an inclusive pathway which respects and is aware of local and regional issues, and there is truly an inclusive process for all. And I think that that's such a huge message and such an important takeaway. So I want to thank all of the panelists and the facilitator for such a wonderful discussion, particularly, I should say, to Bera, because it is very late in Jakarta right now, and I'm so grateful for you taking the time out of your evening to be with us today. But same applies to all of our wonderful panelists who have been so generous with their time and with their knowledge. And I will close out today, but I hope that everybody is going to kind of take these conversations forward and continue to make sure that this important dialogue is being had. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.